Good. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. If you've ever heard, yeah, it's 2:25. Perfect.
Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah, if you ever heard that greeting, that means you either attended one of our meetings or you've watched our recordings, which is a pleasure to welcome you in person. If you have not, that's basically how we greet everyone on our bi-weekly meetings. My name is Maciej. I'm one of the SIG leads, tech leads, whatever. This is Sean, the other person, troublemaker for SIG-CLI, and the third one is Phil. We don't have any super extensive slides. The only slide that we have is contact information for our SIG. This is where we hang out. This is where you can find us. This is when we meet and where we meet. If you have any questions, this is where you'll find us. That's basically all we had. The session idea was that we will be live answering any kind of questions that you might have with regards to what SIG-CLI is up to, about our sub-projects, about how to become involved in SIG-CLI, how to get reviews on PRs, how to write plugins, anything, any kind of questions that you have. We are open to answer. If you have any questions with regards to directions, what we did, we can totally talk about anything you want to hear about with regards to what SIG-CLI is up to, what's in our heads, and everything along those lines.
You know everyone's here for one reason, right?
They want to get their PRs reviewed?
That's I was going to say they want to know how kubecontrol's pronounced.
Oh.
But I don't think we should tell them because then they'll just leave. So.
No, we have an official pronunciation. Since we have the logo, and if you haven't seen it, have a look at myself, Phil, or Sean. That's the official logo. Thanks to amazing Ashley McNamara from Microsoft. She created the logo at the beginning of this year. So since then, it is pronounced Kubectl because of the cuttlefish that we have on our T-shirts. But then again, I'm not consistent. I'm going to be saying everything interchangeably. Most frequently, I'll be using kubecontrol, kubectl, kubectl. Yeah, it happens to me. So I don't think there's any one single pronunciation.
I think we just flip it up to keep the debate alive. Like, we want people arguing with each other at the all-hands event about the
It's like Emacs versus
Vim
versus Vim type of a thing, GNOME versus KDE.
Coke versus Pepsi.
Yeah. And it keeps the discussion running, so that's a good thing. So, does anyone have any questions to kick this off? Sean, behind you.
Here we go. Suraj.
Hi. So there is this kubectl repo under Kubernetes and the main k/k repo. So if I want to start with SIG-CLI, so which repo should I go for, the issues, and what labels should I look for when I start with my first PR?
That's a very good question. So currently, and that will probably be for at least another 6 months to a year, the entire code of Kubectl is within the main Kubernetes repo. So if you want to fix issues, you're going to look in Kubernetes/Kubernetes, and then, and this is the tricky part, we are in the process of splitting the kubectl out of the main repo, which means 95% of the commands are already split out, and they are living inside of what is called a staging repository. So if you are familiar with the structure of the Kubernetes repository, if not, look for a directory called staging.
Who's familiar with staging? Show of hands. All right, a couple people.
Okay, so staging is a way for us to say this is kind of external repository, but for the purpose of ease of development, we are keeping them together in a single repo. We have a mechanism that is then responsible for taking the contents of the staging directories and publishing them to a separate repositories. That's why you will find a Kubernetes/kubectl repository. That repository is being synced on a hourly or so basis from the main Kubernetes repo. So all the changes still will land in the main Kubernetes repo. So staging, source, k8s.io, kubectl, and this is all the commands that are living. There's another repository that we own within staging, which is the CLI Runtime. CLI Runtime is a set of helpers that we extracted to a library so that people who are writing plugins can reuse for their own good so that they don't have to fight with primitives such as printing resources or reading the resources from the server or from the local file. So this is where you're going to look. Unfortunately, the case for issues is not that simple because we happen to have issues in both of the repos. So in the main repo, the easiest thing to find SIG-CLI issues is to use the SIG-CLI label. And I'll be honest, brutally honest, we do not have anything as good first-time issues. And that's probably our big problem. If you want to go through the issues and mark them as good for first time, that would be super awesome. But we haven't done it. There's only a couple of us working actively on a daily basis on the SIG-CLI. So issues from both repos are perfectly fine to be addressed within the main Kubernetes. If it's a smaller issue, such as a single command, I don't know, mistreating or not having some kind of functionality, there's no problem. Just leave a comment that you are working on this issue, open a PR, ping one of us or the maintainer. Well, that's mostly us. But not GitHub. I do encourage people to ping me directly on Slack. I know it sometimes takes me days or weeks to respond.
Sometimes you need to ping you more than once.
Yeah, you need to be persistent, and there has been several people apologizing us that they are pinging me consistently, and I always say, yes, keep pinging me so I don't forget, and your PR will get reviewed. The more pings, the sooner I'll get to it. It's not a problem. I'm not totally treating this as a noise. I'm more than happy because I only have this amount of time within a single day, and there's like this amount of work that I need to do. So I need to somehow squeeze it in the regular day, and I'm pretty sure the same applies for both Phil and Sean.
Yeah,
Actually,
sorry.
Can I ask a question? Who has contributed to Kubernetes before, from a show of hands? Okay. Who is here because they want to learn more about contributing? Okay. And for those of you who didn't raise your hands, why are you here? Anyone? Okay, that's okay. For those who want to contribute to Kubernetes, who wants to contribute something specific versus wants to just get involved with the community and start understanding like how to contribute? So first, like, wants to contribute specific. All right, a couple of you. Second, wants to contribute like just something, anything. Okay, a few more. So one thing is we have kubectl. It's in the main repo. kubectl has a lot of baggage in a lot of dimensions. So one is the libraries it uses. The second is actually just how we develop commands and the semantics we provide, right? So one example is kubectl offers plus or minus one version SKU compatibility. No one wants just plus or one minus version SKU compatibility. Most of all us.
I mean, the plus minus one was there for historical reasons, and I think
it's better than zero.
that was a thing in the early days when Kubernetes API was changing very rapidly. I would say at this point in time, it's more about 2+2 or even 3, where I could say it will work, but I'm not 100% sure. That's why we haven't raised the bar.
It's not tested.
It wasn't tested. But once we get it to a separate repo, and the goal for that, one of the goals is to have a faster releases more frequently than the main Kubernetes repo, we will have to raise the bar to at least 2 or 3 plus minus releases, because if Kubernetes is released once per quarter, and we, for example, will be releasing every month, we need to ensure that every past release of Kubernetes and the next release Kubernetes is always working, which basically means plus minus 3 is the goal. Yeah, you had a question.
Yeah. So I am a complete noob here. So I'm probably going to be asking a lot of basic questions.
Yeah.
When you say plus or minus releases, that means like kubectl is compatible with plus or minus releases of Kubernetes?
The API server, right? So,
Okay.
for example, that means so apply is actually pretty stable at this point, but there was a point in time when the way apply identified how to merge objects together. So for those of you who don't know, what apply does is it merges local configuration into what's remote. The reasons that's necessary is stuff like services insert the cluster IP after the object is created, and you can't just replace that or you blow away the cluster IP. So it does a merging of objects. The way it merges those objects was embedded in structs, and those structs were compiled into the command. And so what that meant is if you were running a version of kubecontrol apply, maybe an older version of kubecontrol apply against a newer server, that you wouldn't have the data of how to properly merge things together. So that's an example of that skew.
And when they say plus or minus 1, they're talking about the minor version. So usually there's this semvar.
Yeah, that was my next question.
That's basically
Major, minor, patch.
Yeah.
Correct.
So that means if 115, it has to work with kube 114, 115, and 116. That's the simplest answer.
The minor version.
Correct.
Yeah. Kube doesn't have the main version bumped, and I think if we would ever bump Kube to V2, that will be a significant redo. I don't think that will happen.
It's not a problem we need to think about right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thanks.
So it's always it's the point something version.
So I'm curious about the decision to split it out into its own repo. So it seems like now we're going to have kubectl has a drifting version. Is it going to be versioned along the same scheme as Kubernetes? And is there going to be a way to easily tell whether the kubectl I'm running is actually going to work with a given cluster? Because I think a lot of problems now, people are going to install it from somewhere, and now they're suddenly going to have to worry about which version they're running and how to run multiple versions. Or is there going to be like a kubectl switch to say what API you're targeting? Like, there's a lot of issues in there. I was curious what your thoughts are.
That's a good question. I think
so.
I mean,
So one of the schemes, I'll
Yeah.
I'll at least give my take on that. So one of the schemes that we're imagining is that we would keep the same major and minor versions in kubectl as in the API server, and that our patch would be what we increment significantly, since as our cadence gets much, much faster, our patches could diverge significantly, but you should be able to say, 1.15 kubectl works with, or 1.n or whatever that n is, works with an API server plus or minus 1 of what's in kubecontrol. That's one way. So that actually we haven't determined exactly how that's gonna work. Just to give you a little background on why we're doing that, we hope to have a significantly faster cadence. In addition, once we pull the code out, it's easier for other projects to reuse or vendor that code. For instance, the drain code, which drains a node, you don't want that logic, in 5 or 6 different places. You'd like just one version of that, and then everybody kind of pulled that one in. And it's just recently that now that we've gotten the drain code into staging, that there's actually quite a bit of activity on that in that code base in order to refactor it to make it significantly more usable elsewhere. So any of the logic that we have in kubecontrol that we get into staging, which eventually is going to get into its own repo, is significantly easier to pull in to other projects. And you wouldn't have to pull in all of Kubernetes along with it.
I think it's worth noting that as we move stuff into staging, it's intended to be safe to use to vendor into CLIs. That code was written with the assumption that it was running in a CLI that will exit. So that means that there's parts of the code we've seen that leak Go routines, for instance. There's just a PR to file to fix some of those. So if you are calling that code from a controller, for instance, you should probably clear with us, hey, do you think this is okay? Or at least maybe audit yourself or something else.
With regards to, there are two things that I wanted to clear up also. With regards to versioning, if you look, for example, at the ClientGo, that is also part of the staging repos and is being published as part of the SIG API machinery, they took a completely different approach. They have their own completely distinct versioning scheme from the main repo. And even though that their release cadence is strictly tied to Kubernetes releases, we haven't settled on a particular path. So like Sean said, there are multiple variants. We haven't figured out which one we will follow. It's definitely something that we will have to tackle eventually. Maybe having some kind of a helper command that will tell you, or a matrix is at least a starting point for us to have. And to answer additionally the split, the reason initially Kubectl ended up in the main Kubernetes repo was that everything historically was dealing with internal versions and whatnot. And the way it was written, it had to live next to the APIs. Now that we spent a good couple of months refactoring significant amount of code, we made it so that it actually works with the API without the need to get all those internals. Unfortunately, due to the fact that it was living in the main repo, a lot of code was interdependent on each other. That's why the staging repos, so that everything that is already safe and doesn't rely on other pieces is just moved over to the staging. That assures that nobody will ever depend on it directly, but rather through an external import, such that will be case.io/kubectl.
And on the versioning, so you were asking about that, like how do you know? One thing I think we started to discuss, and I have a early cap out for, is if we were to write kubecontrol today, like we'd probably make the backwards compatibility much longer, right? And for forwards compatibility, we'd probably do things like check to see if the necessary endpoints exist, and if they don't, just fail the command, right? And so as we develop each command, say, assume that you can run arbitrary kubecontrol versus arbitrary Kubernetes server. And so one of the proposals for moving forward in that direction is to create a new set of commands, like re-implement everything from the ground up that would adhere to this, and pick out ones that this is particularly important for, so say apply. Say if just apply has that semantics, that adds a lot of value. Put that in a different command group and rewrite it outside of the main Kubernetes repo so that it doesn't have the dependency issues with being moved out and all that sort of stuff. And so if you're interested in that, it might be easier as a new time contributor to actually contribute to the commands that maybe we're going to start building outside of the Kubernetes repo.
Like ideally, it should not matter which version of Kubectl you're running. It should always work, whether it's an older one, newer one. It has to work with your Kubernetes. Obviously, we will encourage you to use the newer one because it'll be more featureful. There'll be cool stars and tacos and whatnot. But it should always work with any kind of Kubernetes cluster. That's the goal.
I think we're at that maturity level now.
Yes, yeah. We reached that maturity level that we are pretty confident that it should work. It's the additional features and everything else around it that we want to be able to progress further. Oh, okay, go ahead. You had a question?
Well, I already asked one, so they can go first.
Sure. Hey, Eddie.
Thank you. How does like cross SIG and working group work for you all? So for like server-side apply, for example, kubectl has to change how it's doing application there. Is that something that like your SIG takes on, or does the working group take that on? How does that look for projects like that?
Like the way we do it is actually like individuals aren't siloed into specific SIGs. And so in the case of server-side apply, it was actually Antoine Palisi who implemented that. He was formerly focused on SIG-CLI and doing areas. I think he did actually work with apply and OpenAPI and different things. And so when it came to server-side apply, he just started working on that area of the code base, started attending API machinery meetings. So I'd say cross-SIG joint planning is important. I think working groups are the formal body that these things are supposed to be developed through. In practice, working groups, I think, introduce a lot of overhead with them because it's like a new meeting. So everyone's going to their own meetings, and now there's this new meeting. How are decisions made? And so it's the best way to do it is actually just have individuals develop expertise around the code base and share that expertise and work together on kind of a individual basis.
I mean, it will depend on the scope of the feature. For example, the server-side apply was a major revamp of the API, and the CLI a little bit less maybe. That's why it was decided that it will be useful to form a working group.
There was a working group for that.
Yeah. There will be separate tasks. We have something planned, something that is called dynamic commands that Phil wrote, ACAP, or there's something that we want to track the commands being sent over to the cluster. It will require from us to synchronize with the SIG API machinery, trying to figure out the part of the work. Who will be doing the work? Most probably it will be us because we have the knowledge. I'm personally attending more than just one SIG meetings. I'm active in at least 4 at this point in time, which is like CLI apps, SIG scheduling, API machinery. So we have the knowledge to work with other SIGs, and even if you're not part of any of the SIGs, but your feature that you wanted to add to Kubernetes is cross-cutting several SIGs, it's not a problem to show up. Yes, it will require some additional time from you as the contributor to attend and synchronize with all the SIGs so that they are aware that, yes, there is a cap that I'm planning to work on. This is the feature that I want to see. Sync with them to ensure that does not conflict with their plans, or maybe they already are working on something similar, so you can just pick up whatever they are working on or combine the work together. So it's more about ad hoc decision rather than strict plan, yes, this has to be done this way or the other way around. We're very flexible. There's no strict rules about yes, SIG, no, because that's a different SIG or whatever. Like SIG Networking came to us, showed up to one of our meetings, and was discussing with us the dual IPv4 v6 stack and how that will be presented in the kubectl get commands, for example. It's a minor thing, yet they showed up, told us, we didn't have any issues with that. That was rather a minor change from our point of view. But they just told us that, yes, this is something to be expected.
We're not siloed.
Yeah.
Hi, back to me. I don't mean to sort of take this over, but the description said that there might be a KubeCtl code tour. Is that something you guys could do if I guess nobody is opposed to that?
Yeah, we can do. That's not a problem.
I just had a really quick question. So there's now support for plugins. Is there thoughts about moving some things like kustomize out of KubeCtl and into more of a plugin structure?
Let me talk about that. I think that's a great question. So they're like going kind of to first principles, like how might we design this, right? And one way that was offered, and I even like suggested and wasn't a good idea, was like everything's a plugin. Everything's a separate binary. You just download them all, right? And it was actually Clayton Coleman who I sat down with. I was excited about this idea. And he's like, okay, so each binary is about like 40 megabytes. Like, yeah, and he's like, okay, and you got 100, subcommands in there. And I'm like, I see where you're going with this. And he's like, so you just turned the kubecontrol installation into a 4 gigabyte download? And I was like, and so you can develop things modularly, independently, right? And I think we want to do that. That's definitely the way we want to go. And Go modules actually really help with this, right? The set of commands that we develop as part of the SIG that we would kind of like to publish to everyone, I think we see as ideally being vendored in using Go modules, right? And then, so now it's still 40 megabyte download, but you can actually do stuff, and Kustomize has actually started this approach. Like, you can use Go modules to version each subcommand independently, so you can change the code for an individual subcommand, but when you build the main one, depend on a specific Go module at a specific semantic version and these sorts of things, right? And so you get a lot of the benefits of a sort of plugin development style where folks can even download those individual commands, maybe at head or experimental or something like that. So for the commands we support, that's kind of the direction we're heading, instead of developing them as plugins. With the actual kubecontrol version 2 sort of notion of different API semantics, one way that I explored with that is just make that, for instance, a plugin and develop it out externally entirely. You can go get it as a plugin or use Crew. And then when kubecontrol is fully moved out and when that feels somewhat mature, we just go vendor or use the Go modules to make that in part of the main kubecontrol command set. What's behind your question, I guess? Like, what problem do you see plugins solving by breaking stuff out into them?
I think it's more, well, the problem in particular with Kustomize is being able to get ahead of where the Kustomize that ships with kubecontrol is, and to be able to use newer versions in the same pattern as you would use a version that ships with kubeCtl.
Yes. Okay. So yes, that is a painful problem for us. That problem is actually has to do with some technical details about Go modules and Go vendoring. And when we shipped Kustomize with part of kubecontrol, it was using a Go vendoring module method, and it worked. And then we changed to Go modules. The updates break, and it's been actually spending a lot of time trying to fix that. And so I think the solution there is actually that Jeff, who is the primary maintainer of Kustomize, we are moving off of all dependencies on any staging stuff. The reason we can't update Kustomize in kubecontrol is because it depends on stuff that comes out of staging, which creates a circular dependency. Even though logically it shouldn't be a circular dependency, in practice it is a circular dependency. Go can compile it, but our tools don't work well with it. So by rewriting Kustomize to not depend on that stuff, it will be able to be updated. Now we're not rewriting it just to fix that problem, actually. We're rewriting it because those libraries don't do what we want. And one thing they don't do is like preserve comments, preserve YAML structure, these sorts of things, right? It would be really nice when I customize a file and there's a bunch of comments in there and some structure and format that you keep that. And there's a Go library called the Go YAML library released version 3 of Go YAML. This offers really fine-grained control for display. It includes stuff like comments. It includes stuff like structure. It also includes stuff like, do you want that string quoted? Do you want that list like inlined and this sort of stuff? And we can preserve all that stuff as well as doing actually formatting and normalization. And so the answer is we plan to rewrite kustomize on top of that base for the reasons I just described. When that's done, we'll be able to update kubecontrol in place, and kubecontrol is coming out, and once it's fully out, it wouldn't actually matter. So we would have been able to do it that way. But yes, and that model, I assume, would apply to the other version 2. Like the version 2 commands I described, if we're vendoring them in, would have that same problem of what is the release queue. And I think we want to come up, once we are able to do those updates without doing bunches of hoops and now just flip the version of the command version that we're depending on, then I think we want to come up with like kind of a formal version which says we update. So a straw man would be we update kubecontrol to the latest stable version at the time, like immediately before release, and so you can use that, or you can go get the others.
There's other plan because we would like to have. Currently, Kustomize is being vendored in its entirety into the CLI runtime. So if you reuse CLI runtime, writing your own commands, you're getting basically Kustomize, at least the current version that's in Kubectl, for free. The only downside of that one is that aside from the core, you're getting all those extra commands that Kustomize comes in with. Jeff put a lot of effort into actually restructuring Kustomize. And as one of the goals, we will be going so that the core of Kustomize will be still within the CLI runtime repo so that people can actually build on top of it and reuse the functionality. And that will also allow us and the plugin authors or CLI authors to use the latest Kustomize functionality, at least the core engine. But Kustomize as itself would always be a separate command.
It will always be available as a separate command.
Yeah, it will always be. It will be part, and then the full command will be there still.
Yeah, I have another question around Kustomize. Kick the horn since a little more here. Organizationally, so where do you see SIG-CLI in the application definition and deployment space? Because Kustomize starts to encroach into an area which maybe some would consider not to be really CLI related per se, but more in that area. Is that something
more, can you repeat the last part?
Like SIG-CLI, when you think of CLI, I think, well, maybe it's not the right way of thinking about it, but in a traditional Kubernetes sense of applying resources and updating in very, very direct type of Kubernetes API operations. Kustomize starts to get into the space of application definitions and twizzling with YAML and things of that area. And I'm just wondering, like, in terms of SIG-CLI, what's the scope? Is there a point in time where Kustomize will be moved out to another SIG or something?
Excellent question. So, like, there's always been. Do you mind if I take this one, Maciej?
No, go ahead.
There's always been overlap between API machinery, SIG apps, and SIG-CLI, right? So, for example, apply hit the patch API for API machinery. It had this strategic merge patch, which was developed for apply and not intended to be put together by hand by humans, right? And so that's, again, we're not very siloed, right? And so when you talk about scope, there's like the scope of SIG-CLI, and then there's the scope of the Kubernetes project, I guess. The latter, I think, being the more interesting of the two. The stuff in Kustomize actually came directly out of kubecontrol commands that pre-existed Kustomize. Now, I'd be happy to talk about whether those are in scope or that sort of thing, but if you look specifically at Kustomize, like setting the namespace there is a kubecontrol apply -n flag, right? If you look at setting labels and annotations, there's kubecontrol set labels, there's kubecontrol set annotations. Image, there's kubecontrol set image, right? It kind of goes on. Patch, there's a kubecontrol patch command, right? Where it gets a little bit less obvious, the mapping is like the bases, right? And the bases, but there is precedent for that. There was kubecontrol apply -f URL, right? And so this is kind of that same thing where the base is the URL. And generating config maps and generating secrets also commands for both of those things that work pretty much exactly the same way. So the original vision for Kustomize, you can think of kind of two ways, right? One is there's this whole declarative application management space, right? And so like, is Kustomize like the one true tool for solving that entire space, right? And the answer is no. Another thing is, hey, there's this declarative application managed space. You gave me a bunch of commands that don't work declaratively, but they're useful and people are using them, right? And like this -in flag, like obviously I want it to apply for everything that I'm applying because I want to apply it to a namespace, but I can't review ahead of time that everything's going in that namespace, right? These sorts of things. So that was the scope of Kustomize specifically. What is the scope of the SIG? What is the scope of the project? I'd say that Brian Grant from SIG Architecture has drawn the line in the sand at packaging, right? And packaging is a bit weird, right? Because is any directory of configuration a package? And if I can apply a URL, is that a package, right? And so I think these are kind of the wrong questions to ask because I'm not sure what we're trying to solve necessarily with asking them, right? But kind of saying painting broad strokes, the tools we build should be able to work with declarative configuration that exists in a file system or maybe some endpoint that we can fetch that uses something like HTTP, right? Git is kind of borderline, I guess I'd say, where it's like a well-known protocol, but maybe less. Kustomize does it, for instance. I don't know if we're going to push that as, continue to develop that further as a major thing versus recommending you just pull it locally. So I'd say package management I see more as stuff as like indexing groups of packages and curation and creating universes and creating update channels for these sets of packages, like that sort of stuff. I would say we're going to be careful about what we do. Again, there's actually a project that's a crawler that helps you find YAML config on the internet, right? And so you can search for YAML config when you want to see examples of how to make like deployments and that sort of stuff. I'd say that's not a package manager. It doesn't create a universe for you to install from. It's more of a search engine.
Yeah, we touched the universe a little bit with plugins.
With plugins, yes, but
that's
I'd say
but that's strictly for
that's
CLI.
not a package of configuration.
No, it's not.
Then there's like, how do we make working with configuration easier and better for end users? Does that just belong in the CLI? Does that work in the UI? What about SIG UX that just got founded? There's this, I don't know if you're familiar, there's a project called KUI, which has been collaborating very closely with us in SIG-CLI and kind of, I'd say, incubating as a sub-project, which would then take declarative configuration approaches and visualize it.
In non-CLI type of
in a non-CLI stuff, should that be in CLI? Should that be in some other SIG? I'm not sure. I think like if we're all working together to just do what's right for the user, the distinctions of exactly where some of these things land, it's okay if like we kind of figure them out as we go and if we move things around. I think most people in the project are not looking for more ownership. They're looking to get stuff off of their plate, right? And so like I don't envision someone from SIG Apps being like, I want to own that code. I think they want to go like, I'm not here.
Yeah, we already have a bunch of SIGs owning their own.
Everyone's busy.
Lanyard. So,
but I guess to wrap up your question, because taking a long time to answer it, I do think we want to invest in figuring out how to lead users and provide direction for how do you work with declarative configuration, right? Like, and we're actively prototyping ideas that we're developing. I've demonstrated to some of the folks in the audience here. I think the principles behind that are that we want configuration to be stored in like a data state, like the configuration for either the actual Kubernetes API or an abstraction like a CRD or something like this, which isn't the Kubernetes API, but is something, a meta API that configures the Kubernetes APIs. And there's a lot of ways of doing that. Like templating is one approach. A lot of people use templating. I'm not saying templating is a bad approach. I don't think we have a strict opinion on it. What I'm interested in is, if you want to use templating, how do we facilitate using templating with other tools, right? Because one problem with a template is you can't analyze it, right? If you want to like lint a template and say like, did this specify the CPU, right? You can't do that stuff, right? That means it doesn't interoperate with the person over there whose sub-project is to create a linter, right? So figuring out, so the first step in this was the vision behind Kustomize. You use your Helm charts, right? You get to use Helm, then you use Kustomize to customize them. Now you don't need to go in there and fork the Helm charts. We've learned a lot since developing Kustomize. In that time, we've come up with a lot of new innovative approaches that work with Kustomize, that may be built into Kustomize in some way and might be exposed independently. But again, the focus there is to figure out how can we lead the community in techniques that allow composition and not getting siloed into like one specific tool or that sort of thing.
Okay, let's get Sean to do a code.
So who wants to?
We have like 50 minutes still, so.
Yeah. So who would like to see a little bit, at least where the kubectl code lives and what it?
Yeah, just let's look at one of the commands.
Okay.
I remember annotate is following the strict patterns.
Mm-hmm.
You go up and out. So
let me actually. So I think that actually
we set up a patterns. Not every single command follows the patterns, but we will try to show, and it's fine if you open a PR, redoing the old commands to follow the new patterns that Sean will be showing in a bit. Definitely worth the PRs. So don't be scared if you see some of the commands not following the same patterns.
So this is a slide from, we had a workshop on Monday on kubectl development. And I brought up this slide because it actually has the code locations, the three that we really care about. And we've been talking about staging, and maybe that's not as clear to some people, kind of a new concept. But the code lives under, and when I say K, it's root, that's just like the top of the Kubernetes development tree. Staging source, case.io, kubectl, and then we're moving. There's a little bit of the code, maybe 5% that's still left under package kubectl. That's moving over to staging as well. So I think we've already said a few things about staging, but I'll just give my quick take, which is there's a two-step process to get the code into its own external repo, and the first step is this staging. And in order to be able to get into staging, you have to cut all the dependencies from core Kubernetes. And so you've proved that it's not in core Kubernetes anymore, and so it's eligible to be able to move to an external repo. There's specific permissions that are enforced to ensure that none of the dependencies still exist for the core Kubernetes. Did that make any sense? Does anybody have any questions on that? Okay. So let's just quickly. So I just did an LS. I just did an LS on this staging, and you could see there's a couple levels down is package CMD. This is where all of the kubectl subcommands live, almost all of them. So you could see, from exec, there's actually some above that, all the way down to wait. So you mentioned annotate. Let's have a quick look in there.
Yeah, I remember annotate was very nice, very readable, and followed the new patterns. So if we look in there, then we can see that there's usually a file that has to do with this subcommand, as well as a test for it and a build file. So if we look at it,
So there's a particular pattern that every single one of these subcommands looks like. Do we have the other? Sorry, thanks. I'm going to get rid of this guy. Cheers. So there's a particular pattern that every single one of these subcommands looks like. It has options that are going to be filled in from flags. You'll see that a lot of the usage gets defined here, and then it all gets packaged up into what's called a Cobra command, which is a third-party library to organize CLIs. And let's have a quick look at that.
Who's familiar with Cobra here? All right.
That's good. I would say Cobra is the standard these days, and
Yeah.
Go.
So you can see here's where we create the Cobra command for annotate, and it connects all the usage, like the long usage, short usage, examples. And then another common pattern that you're going to see is that almost all of the run that happens when this finally gets executed, there's always three functions that get called. There's a complete, validate, and then run the command, run annotate. The complete will fill in the options and basically complete that option struct. The validate will validate those options. And then the run actually, that's where the rubber hits the road and you actually run the command. And so underneath it, you're going to see all of the connection of the flags, and Cobra knows how to basically parse those flags, and you will fill the data from the flags into your options variables like overwrite. You see the address of o.overwrite. So you're filling in the option struct with the value from a flag if there's an overwrite flag. So am I getting like too deep into the, is this? So actually a lot of this was covered in this, the workshop that happened on Monday. So if you guys want to see that video, actually there were some technical hiccups, but I think that at least the presentation of it, a lot of the content would be really, if this is what you're interested in, is finding out the deep dive into how kubectl or kubecontrol actually works and what the code looks like. That's what that.
Should we maybe do a check and see, like, we could go very deep technically.
I mean,
in the code stuff. We could go like less. Do we want to do?
With the code, it's pretty simple. If you look at one command, you'll pretty much get any command, because 90% of the code, at least in an annotate, is a boilerplate that is copied over and over from command to command. There will be always options. It has all the options that command has, plus the extra that are needed for execution. Complete is setting up clients and stuff like that. You'll most probably copy them over from, we have something that is called, it's one of the staging repos, it's called sample CLI plugin. It literally is the simplest possible command that could possibly live. So complete will be just that. Validate, well, that will depend on the logic of your command. It is possible for it not to exist if there's no validation for your command, but the actual meat of the command and something that you might be interested in lives inside of the run command. Maybe let's show the run annotate.
Sure.
I guess that's like literally all the thing, because the rest is, I do hope, pretty self-explanatory. It's like wiring flag to Cobra flags. Complete is pretty reasonable because we're just getting dry run flag, setting stuff. But
let's talk about the builder.
Run annotate is like literally where the actual functionality of the command is. Here, for example, we are using something called a ResourceBuilder. ResourceBuilder is a is a structure and with entire built-in functionality that is living inside of the CLI runtime. So if you're thinking about writing a CLI plugin for kubectl or basically your own command for interacting with Kubernetes API, ResourceBuilder from the CLI runtime will be very useful. Why would you ask? First of all, it has all the API knowledge, and it can either connect to a remote cluster, read the resources you're interested in, or it can read the same resources from a file. All that is being currently passed through here. Unfortunately, for historical reasons, if you have a look at this command, it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 additional steps that we do. You might wonder what's unstructured, local param, continue on error, namespace param, and whatnot. If someone's interested in squashing this thing into 1, 2 calls, I would like to see that happen. 90% of the commands is copying, pasting this thing. Actually, this one is slightly different because that one is using unstructured. I don't want to go into details what's unstructured and what's typed. But basically, the idea is I would like to minimize that invocation to I want builder. That's it. And then, not to mention that after whether it's local or non-local, it's adding additional bunch of stuff. It's nice, but we are pretty certain that 90% of cases, 90% of the commands that we have within kubectl could be using the defaults. And we would like to see this. At the end of the day, what it does, it invokes do, which is actually do something. And depending on whatever you said before, it will either read data from a file or read data from a remote server. Set annotate, as you might be more or less familiar. It will basically annotate given resource. So if I want to put annotation on a pod, it will read the pod, add annotation onto it, and then either write it or push it to the server. Eventually, we're doing some check. And then there's iteration over resources at the bottom. We are reusing visitor pattern. The ResourceBuilder returns a result, and you can iterate over the results. And we are using visitor pattern inside of the ResourceBuilder again, and we are basically calling update annotation function, which is as simple as, oh yeah, add those annotation that the user specified. And basically, most of the command will be reusing the same pattern. Label will be identical. The only difference will be instead of setting annotations, we are setting labels. Set resource or set limit, set image. They're pretty much the same. The only difference between set image and this one is that set image is using something called polymorphic helpers. That's, again, part of the CLI runtime. It just knows how to get a pod template from different resources. And then it just sets image, posts it to the server, you're done. And then eventually, depending on whether I want to only get print the resource or push the result to the resource, we print or push the result. Does that make sense? Are there any questions?
Is this helpful? Is this are we going in the correct direction here, or too deep, or yeah, Mike?
Get is different. Please don't ask about get.
Oh,
Get is it should get simpler soon because get historically was had the knowledge how to print the resources. We, together with the API machinery, put a lot of effort into moving the knowledge how to print resources to the server. So these days, one of the problems why we did it was that if people had CRDs, kubectl did not know how to print their CRDs. But the CRD authors knew exactly that they care about field A, B, C, and D. kubectl only printed name and the creation date. That's why we extended the CRD definition for the authors to be able to specify, oh, I want to have this, and that, and the other field printed. But that's the knowledge that exists on the server. That's why currently server sends to the kubectl something that is called a table, which is a header and just the data that we need to print. And I think 1.18 will be the time where we will remove the code responsible for printing the resources from kubectl entirely. If not 18, 19, I do hope is when this should happen. That will greatly simplify the code inside of the get command, because currently it has a bunch of knowledge that already exists on the server for a good couple of releases.
So what's the difference between using the resource builder versus just like a client? And why doesn't kubectl use like kubeclient?
So you can freely use the client, and that's not a problem. The resource builder, the only difference will be that client will get you a particular resource right away. So if you ask for pods, you're going to get pods. Resource Builder gives you the flexibility of working with multiple types of resources, which you don't have. There is something called dynamic client, but that unfortunately is similar to the unstructured, which means you're not going to get a specific type of resource. You're going to get a map of string to empty interface representation of the resource from the server. So that's one thing, and client will always reach the server. Resource Builder can either get data from the local disk, local file, local input stream, or from the server, depending on how the flags the user specified. So it's more like it's a wrapper around ClientGo that we just reuse over and over and again. That's why we figure out let's create a wrapper that just does this, so that you can actually focus on writing the functionality of the command and not the same code of getting the resource, reading the resource, and whatnot.
And there's, for the client, there's one other abstraction, which is this helper that is actually very common in kubectl. But there's actually many, as you mentioned, there's many different types of clients, including like a discovery client, a dynamic client, client set from ClientGo. The commonality amongst all of them are usually that they wrap the REST client, and the REST client understands that REST protocol, the HTTP method, as well as the URL. The URL, if like you were getting a pod in a particular namespace, it's gonna, there's a particular URL to hit that endpoint on the API server for it. But it turns out, you're right, it is a little bit, I think, a little bit awkward that you have this builder that is an abstraction for, it's basically just retrieving resources, but what it gives you is that, as Maciej said, it abstracts away where you get it from, either the API server or the file system. It's going to get this YAML or this object, and it's going to decode it usually into, or not usually, but sometimes into a strongly typed Golang struct, like a pod. If it's a pod, it'll be decoded into this struct. And then there's this other abstraction, which actually is kind of more, here's the CRUD operations against the API server that you could do. Does that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's good, thanks.
It's a similar pattern that we also use in the other direction. I don't know, like about 2 years ago, every single command almost re-implemented the idea of printing resources. And if you look at Cube, I don't know, 14, 12 for sure, there was no consistency. Currently, if you specify -o yum JSON name, every command across the board is consistent with that. Beforehand, well, some had yum, some had JSON, some had both, some had short names, some had wide output. It wasn't consistent. That's why we created something called a resource printers, and most of the commands are using that one as well. And then the user just specifies the flags, and we always print it. And the author, for the author, it's as simple as, oh, I want to have resource printer. I'm going to expose the flags, and I'm going to invoke print object. And that print object will consume the flags specified by the users. They are common for across the board, and it will know just how to print the actual object.
So this is just one more example, delete. The delete command, there's the builder. It's going to be, that's how you would retrieve the resource. And then you run delete.
Yeah, there's the delete result at the bottom.
Yep.
Yeah, this is probably a design question. There were several references mentioned to server versus client functionality, so get and then the apply command. So we also have a situation where we're running kubectl in a pod as part of an operator that we've created, and in particular some of the customized functionality that we've been talking about. Sometimes, we wonder about whether, so what is the determination, I guess, that you make with respect to functionality being part of the client versus the server? Because I could imagine a scenario, especially if we're creating operators, for example, that need customized-like functionality, that it may be the case that that type of functionality may be more convenient to be in the server rather than the client. So what is the decision, how do you make the decision?
So it's basically historical. It's basically been historical up till now. It's just been, what somebody has implemented, and then after the fact we said, oh, it makes a lot more sense that apply be on the server so that multiple clients can actually hit the endpoint and do this instead of having this massive amount of apply code and complexity that it's going to be really hard for other clients and controllers to re-implement. Go ahead.
I can give you a couple things that go into that decision-making process as well.
But it's a case by case, always.
It's a case by case.
It's a case by case. I haven't seen us doing, oh, we're going to move everything to the server.
No. That's
not how we
not
work.
a goal. Moving something to the server is a non-goal, right? Because delivering value is our goal, right? Types of things that don't make sense necessarily moving to the server, quote unquote, are things that work on a collection of resources, right? So the server, and when we say server, we mean API server in this context, operates on a single resource, right? So something like the namespace portion of kustomize, moving that into the API server, is not something we have any plans of doing. I don't think anyone has any idea how that would even work. People have suggested, oh, do a mutating webhook that kind of mutates the namespace of things as they come in. And it's I'm not sure you really want that. Another consideration is, how soon do you want this in the folks' hands, right? Because folks are running old versions of Kubernetes, right? And so say we introduce a new feature like deletion is something we've been talking about, and declarative deletion. And maybe you can just annotate a resource to delete it through apply, which could be implemented in server-side apply pretty trivially if that's what we decided, right? And so there's two considerations there. The first is, how mature is that? How do we want to roll it out? How do we want to enable it for folks, right? And when we put stuff in the API server, like that deletion command, or that deletion piece, it's really hard to change afterwards, right? If we put it in the CLI and make it a flag and we change our decision on how to implement it, not so hard, right? Keep the flag around. We put it in the API, really, really hard to change how we implement that. So that's one consideration of introducing the client first, let it mature, move it to the server. Second piece of that is that declarative deletion piece is trivial to implement actually in the client for people using kubectl apply. And so if we put it in the server side and we say, hey, if you're using Kubernetes 110, for instance, don't worry, you just need to upgrade 7 times, and then you have that functionality too, right? And so I think in those cases, we may leave it in the client even after moving it to the server for version skew reasons or convenience, especially as we move to like longer versions of longer version skew, we could imagine saying, okay, we're going to support a year and a half worth of Kubernetes releases, and we'll continue to support it in the client, and you get that behavior.
And there's the other important factor is whether the command is meant to work with extensions or not. Get was a very good example of that one. How we within the Get kubectl are supposed to know what's your extension, what's your CRD. The same problem applies to describe, and we are currently discussing that with the SIG API machinery, how to move describe to the server. Same way we moved get. Server knows, the CRD authors knows what are the main fields that they want to see printed as part of it. They can embed that information inside of the CR definition. The kubectl get will only then read that data. That was one of the reasons why we did get, and we moved it. Like, it is called server-side printing officially. It's not the server-side get, it's the server-side printing. If you find a flag in the get, there's a -- server-side print, which is false. But
you did say something really interesting, which is you're calling, I think you said customize and apply from a pod, right? And so in addition to the should it be client-side, should it be server-side discussion, I think there's actually a middle ground, which is if you're running your own operator or your own thing in the server in a container, making it so you can bundle those commands, right? Either they could be libraries, there's Go libraries, but not everyone writes Go. So maybe as executables, right? And make sure that the way we expose the interface to the executable makes it so that you can build server-side components that still leverage that behavior without necessarily putting it in the API directly.
Yeah, hi. So while writing some CLI tools using ClientGo, I found kubectl explain command very helpful, but then it doesn't work sometimes with CRDs. So
yeah, I mean, the explain command by default is reading the open API information that we are keeping on the server. And this is, again, an effort. Like you see, we interact with other SIGs a lot. This is an effort that we, in cooperation with the API machinery, because we're not doing any magic. If you look under explain, what we actually do is we read the open API information that the server publish, and we just display it nicely in a tabular form. That's basically it. So for any CRD to have a proper kubectl explain data, it has to have a proper metadata embedded in the CRD definition. If you have that, and recently with the work towards the structured schema on the server side, it does require some additional extra work from the CRD authors to comply with this. But here, the KubeBuilder, which is, I wouldn't call it our project, but it's a project that we partially take part in. Phil was one of the co-authors initially. KubeBuilder has a controller gen, and as part of the controller gen, you can generate that schema for your CRDs. And we, for example, in OpenShift are heavily reusing that mechanism to ensure that the CRDs are explainable to users. Yes, but that's a server-side thing that just CRD authors need to put, and then we just explain.
Can I ask you all a question? Or a follow-up question to your question?
Yeah, one more question.
Okay, can I ask you about your explain question, though?
Sorry?
I want to ask you a question. Okay. So you said you learned about the APIs through explain. Well, why do you think I came?
I don't know.
I was just going to ask them questions. You said you learned about the API through explain, And I've asked this question before, but I'm curious to see if the answers are the same. Who here learns about kubecontrol through the command help as the primary way? Show of hands. Okay. Who here learns about kubecontrol through the documentation, either on Kates.io or the KubeBuilder book or other sources like that? A little bit. Okay. And then who learns about it through like blog posts and tweets and that sort of thing? A little bit. Okay. So this is consistent with the results from previously asking this, that people learn the most through the built-in help. And we're incorporating that feedback actually into the new commands we develop and make sure that actually the built-in command is the first class help, and then we go and build the documentation for the site like from that, either generating it or something else.
Because 90% of the time, I don't want to go out of terminal just for the help. So it helps if I get documentation inside terminal itself.
I totally support that one. Like kubectl run command, that's a pain. And if I'm interested in running cron job that I wrote, I explicitly put a help over there so that I can always copy paste that one. It works fine every single time.
We put in examples for ourselves.
Yeah.
Like,
it was a selfish thinking, but I know it works. And like, every single time I'm going to do -h, oh yeah, that's copy paste, works. I need a sample deployment. Yeah, kubecontrol create deployment -h. Yeah, that's copy paste. You're done.
How is that going to change as you start to support multiple versions of the API?
That shouldn't change in any way.
Okay, so for the recording, the question was, how will that change when we support multiple versions of the API? And do you mean, which API are you referring to?
The Kubernetes API, right? At what version of kubectl is there any dependencies, anything that can help from the console that are going to be impacted by a change to the Kubernetes API?
Okay, so
The question
specifically,
was, the question was whether we rely on anything on the server when we are presenting the helps for the commands, whether that will change after we are in a separate repo and we release faster.
No, we don't compile anything. So I described the apply disaster of depending on structs. We don't do that much anymore. Explain uses OpenAPI. That's why it can work against CRDs if CRDs publish the metadata as part of their definition. So yes, these specifically the help commands will pull down that information. Now, that's like 90% true. Like I think there's certain things like you can run help on a command, and then it will show you this is how you use the command, but maybe it didn't talk to the server, and the server doesn't support that API. And when you run the command, there will be an error or something like that. So if you run a help command that says, give me information about this API, it should pull down that information about the API. But we haven't done stuff like dynamically guarding which commands are going to be exposed based on what's published by the API server.
It happens during execution eventually. So the only example that I know of currently that is, it will change its behavior depending on the versions of the server that you have is kubectl run, and that it's a mess.
Who uses kubecontrol run? Awesome. Only a couple
You're
of you.
using kubectl run for particular reasons, or you're always trying to figure out what kind of set of flags will give you whatever you're interested in it? Or you're just using copy paste, oh, this will create me a deployment, I'm going to copy paste this.
It's really good for teaching and workshops. It's like getting something going really quick.
Are you okay if we remove kubecontrol run?
You're going to anyway, so.
Yeah, I know. I mean, no.
Well, but no, like
honestly, we're not going to remove it entirely. The plan is remove all the burden from the kubectl run and leave it like dumb simple. Similar to Docker run, Podman run, whatever run. Run the most basic unit, which is a pod in Kubernetes world, in a cluster, which is, I think, a fair starting point.
usage. I've heard that a lot, actually, of the teaching case. And what I'd rather do is actually develop a command to help users learn how to use the system, right? Like kubecontrol run may be the best tool you have right now to teach people, but there's also a lot of flags in there. And I bet not all of those flags are really the things you want to use to teach people, right, for instance? And so if we were to take that and say, actually, let's just make a command focused on teaching people how to use the system, that's what I'd like to see. And we could maybe do that as a plugin or something like that.
I would even welcome that kind of a command that will help me start it, help me start the workshop or anything like that as a built-in command, because yes, we are more than 100% aware that this is a problem, and how from run that will be creating just a pod, direct people towards create deployment, create job, create cron job, create service, expose deployment, expose service, and all those bits that are already there. We do miss this kind of run to, oh, I need to this. The problem currently that exists is after I'm done with run, I need to know the primitives that I want to create to be able to match, oh, I actually want to kubectl create deployment. But the user that is just starting, that just run his image in a cluster, doesn't know that he needs a replica set or deployment.
So
maybe
like
some kind of a make my pod super awesome, and so that it works if I kill it accidentally. If somebody writes me this type of command, I'll be more than happy to accept that one.
We're talking about new contributions, so maybe this is a great
Yes.
example. Ideally as a plugin, because honestly for you it's going to be a lot easier to get that merged. But like, yeah, I mean, if we're going to use run to teach, like the help message actually should probably look really different. Like we should have really maybe verbose help messaging, or like developing ideas around that would be really great.
Have you looked at the help message
Yeah,
for the run command? That's like two or three screens.
No, sorry. After
One?
you run, when you run the command, it should tell you what it did, right? Like,
Yeah.
should say, I created
No,
this thing, here's
I'm,
what the log.
I'm saying about the current run. The current run,
It's
like
not great.
One page is just the flags. The other page is just the
No, that's a great
examples.
teaching tool. I love that.
Yeah.
But is
I
it,
wrote it. I wrote some pieces of run command, and I never know what's the proper combination of the flags. Thankfully, there are examples, but that's not good. Definitely.
isn't run just a very special, I guess, a primitive or a legacy, a case of like a parameterized YAML? Aren't you just kind of applying parameterized YAML that's been prepackaged as part of
Mostly, actually,
It's a legacy. Yes, it's
No.
a legacy, and I'll stop my answer here.
Yes, it's basically templating, but that's what the create commands are, and we actually are directing people towards create commands. I'd say my preference would be to, if we had a clean slate, I'd take the create commands we have today, have them output YAML, tell people to pipe them to apply, and then we're teaching people the more patterns. Some interesting things about kubecontrol run actually are -t-i. Those are actually super useful, like being able to connect. I can imagine those being super useful for
Create
teaching
and already
commands.
attach. Yeah.
So, I mean, yes, it's mostly templating, but it does have a couple niceties in there.
Oh, maybe I'll tell a little bit about how you if you wanna create, because you've mentioned that at the beginning. So fixes are, you just submit a patch, open a PR, and ping us for reviews. It also helps if you show up on the SIG-CLI meetings and bring to all the people attention that, yes, I created this is the type of a fix. I do hope that we will be able to combine some kind of maybe not necessarily live reviews, but rather as these are the interesting bits that the SIG-CLI should be looking at.
I want to touch on that. Like, a lot of you said you're here. Wow, this mic's way better. A lot of you said you're here because you want to learn to contribute. And I think one major misconception is that the way to contribute to this project is not like just show up and start taking issues or asking for work. Like, this project is driven by relationships, right? And people working with one another. And so many of the problems like really need to be discussed to figure out what we want, because it may be simple to add whatever flag you're talking about, but like we have to kind of support that forever, once we add that, right? And so we want to be really careful before we add these sorts of things. And there's probably like 3 different ways the UX can work. And maybe it's consistent with this other command, but it's actually not the way we want to write it. And so there's a lot of debate that goes into each one of these things. And so having those sorts of relationships, one kind of removes the like reading the comments and being like, what was behind this comment? And I thought they told me to do this, but now this other person is saying not to do it, and that sort of stuff. So if you understand kind of the dynamics and how the system works, and I think it'll be a lot easier, and it helps us actually work with you, right? Because we're probably going to have to give you a lot of context as you develop this stuff, right? I mean, I would say for new contributors, maybe some of you actually might have developed it on your own, in which case, great, you don't need that. And we've even, Paris suggested to me doing like a shadowing program, kind of like the release team has done shadowing roles, where you do like a 3-month shadow or something like that. So that's something that might be worth exploring.
It's perfectly valid, and we can do some similar shadowing reviewers up to the approver levels, because we do miss people looking after kubectl, after the commands and everything else. So we definitely once, like, we don't bite. We try to have fun meetings every other week on Wednesdays. So definitely show up and talk to us. And then again, if you have a major feature that you're considering working on, then definitely you want to show up. Throw the idea you have into the agenda, discuss it through with the group, and only after you have a more or less consensus, the next step will be write a cap, because that's what we usually end up asking people to do. And whether that will be, you will be directed towards, oh, give it a try, write a plugin, or write a cap, and we'll see where it goes. That will depend on the discussion. So definitely the meetings is worthy attending. There are, I do hope at some reasonable times. I know we're kind of not APAC friendly.
Europe, US friendly.
Europe, US, yes. Maybe a little bit less with APAC, I guess.
Yeah.
So once we're on the topic here of the dynamics, I just wanted to give 2 quick pieces of advice on PRs that you send in this. I think this applies to the entire community. Number 1 is write a test that proves that your code works. So any of your submissions should have unit tests, and maybe even if it's more major, an integration test. And then 2, to the extent possible, make these PRs as small as possible, just because, so that they're that much more easy to understand and easier to review. And you'll find that your cadence goes a lot faster. So I broke up a lot of the PRs that I wrote into, from one large PR into literally 10 smaller PRs, just so that I could get there's there can be problems with like how slow prow can be and how long it takes to merge, but one massive PR is just really you're shooting yourself in the foot a lot of the time, just because
there's a good thing about doing lots of smaller PRs. Your GitHub counter will faster go out.
So just a couple of pieces of practice.
Time for 2 more questions, I think, right? So did we derail your question? Did you get your answer? I can't remember what it was. Yeah, we got it, okay. All right. Oh, sorry, you. Yeah.
That's okay. I just had so back to, we were talking about kubectl explain. I saw a nice trick from Joe where you can like toss on the recursive flag and like pipe that out to a file. And like that gives you almost like a template to start working with that has like all the options on there. Has like a full-fledged like generate me a new deployment file.
Yes, that's from a create command or a run command.
From explain command.
All right, let me give you.
It will be.
But also -o dry run or minus dry run -o YAML will spit out.
Yeah, but that's more from explain, get a template with all the fields commented out from the data, from the explain. That would be pretty cool. I would support having something like that.
We are exploring techniques for that. I think what you're describing, like the problem you're trying to solve is how do I get started with the configuration, right? And there's a number of techniques we've described. We've been exploring specifically ones that are going to work with CRDs and work with extension mechanisms. So doing it from the open API, I think, is effectively what you're describing, is a way that we've prototyped and experimented with, and it's better, but it still has a number of issues, I think. And so I actually have a couple prototypes of ways of doing this. If it's something you're interested in, let's follow up.
I have a bit different question. So I used to work for developer CLI for OpenShift. So when we started with noob approach for CLI structure, like having a CMD directory and with all commands. Then we looked at CLI runtime, and then we had this complete validate run pattern. So I have this question, like how you got inspiration of moving to this pattern, or what all things you faced that so that you moved to this pattern? I mean, I really like this pattern.
The dynamic create.
Or
It's
the
more
complete
about
validate.
the
Yeah, as in
observation that
this-
we got from, oh, we're getting more CRDs, how we can bake in the knowledge. Because currently, if you look at the create commands, they are very simple, but unfortunately, they rely on the Go types being present within the kubectl during compilation. And we can't go this path towards with the CRD, obviously. So we need to have a dynamic way for kubectl create to know what are the actual required fields, the minimal set of required fields on a CRD. And that's why Go Open API comes into play, because we have that information in Open API. We can get that and try to create some kind of a minimal resource that you can then submit to the server.
Also, yeah, both versions, Q and CRDs, actually present the same way, where the client doesn't know about them. And so this would solve both of those.
Okay, last question.
So changing topics a little bit, what are your 2-3 favorite shortcuts, hacks using kubectl?
I always alias kubectl to KC. Guess I'm too lazy.
I'm not going to count that one.
So I've just thrown up on the screen the
API resources?
API versions. And so this will tell you at this version what GVKs are supported for that kubectl.
There are 2 commands.
Yeah, so this is API versions, and then the next one
return
is API resources.
All the versions, and the other one is API resources, which will return all the resources on the server that you can limit just to the size of the specific API group.
If I could.
Yeah. So maybe that I would say that explain is my current favorite.
I'm excited about the debug command that's coming
Yeah,
down.
that's
That one looks
too.
pretty cool with the ephemeral containers.
Yeah.
Sean, what's your favorite? This thing?
These were super helpful. I think it's really important to understand the difference between like your run, create, set image type of commands versus once you get into a more mature development cycle, it should all be applies. And that, the more you know about apply, actually, that's only going to help you. Like those imperative commands, the runs and the creates and the sets, those are really good, like in the workshop instance and to practice. But once you're in the real world, in production CI/CD, you got to be using apply and declarative commands.
All right. So maybe a final word. We can each have a final word. Mine will be
Show up at the next SIG-CLI.
show up. Well, I'd say
Hang out with us. We want to.
yeah. Well, we want to see you all. I expect the next few months going to be sporadic for everyone between various holidays, and it's always a tough quarter for everyone. So, don't feel like you need to show up in the next week, or we're going to be like, why didn't anyone show up? But do come sometime in the next 6 months. Show up. Say you want to be assigned issues. Be a little bit patient with us and allow us the time to try and find the right match to set you up for success, and then be less patient with us when after we give it to you, you nag us about
Yeah.
advice.
Yeah. Thanks so much.